There I was sitting in my office, my mind racing through numbers, contracts, and potential partners, trying to lock down a deal that could push our company to the next level. $20 million. It had a nice ring to it. More than just success, it was a gateway to a future I'd barely imagined a few years ago. We were so close, I could almost feel it. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the AC and the persistent ticking of the clock, marking time against my thoughts. My phone buzzed. A small irritation at first. I ignored it, too caught up in the whirlwind of business projections and negotiations. But then it buzzed again. And again. I glanced at the screen, ready to dismiss it as another round of spam calls. But instead, I saw 3 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. Odd. Normally, I would have shrugged it off, but something in the pit of my stomach gnawed at me, a feeling I couldn't shake. I hesitated for a moment. Then it buzzed again a 4th time. Curiosity finally got the better of me. I swiped to answer. Before I could even say a word, the voice on the other end came fast and sharp, like he'd been waiting impatiently for me to pick up. "You better tell Mallory to stop screwing around, Ethan." I froze. Mallory? My Mallory? The voice kept going, hurried and angry, like the guy was on the edge of losing it. "She thinks she can play games, but if she doesn't deliver what she promised, things are going to get real messy, you understand?" I had no idea who the hell this was, or what the hell he was talking about, but the mention of her name, my wife's name, in this stranger's mouth, sent a chill through me. I gripped the phone tighter. "Who the hell is this?" I demanded, keeping my voice steady, though something in my chest began to tighten, harden. "What are you talking about?" There was a pause, like he hadn't expected me to be so direct. Then his tone shifted, less aggressive, but still tense, as if he'd just realized something was off. "Wait, this isn't David?" "No, it's not," I replied, my pulse quickening now. "Who's David? What does he have to do with my wife?" Another pause, this one longer. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. The guy was trying to figure out whether to continue, to backpedal, or to hang up. "I've said enough," he muttered, his voice dropping to a growl. "Tell Mallory she's playing a dangerous game." And just like that, he hung up. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at my phone, the buzzing silence in my ears louder than the conversation itself. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. My first instinct was disbelief. Mallory? Dangerous games? That couldn't be right. I stood up, pacing the length of my office, trying to shake off the bizarre conversation. Maybe it was some kind of mistake. I mean, Mallory was busy too. She'd been more involved with community work lately, volunteering at local events, handling projects with some charity groups. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing remotely resembling a dangerous game. But that voice, the way he said her name like he knew her, like they were connected in a way I didn't understand, it nagged at me. And then something else hit me. David. Who the hell was David? And why had this guy thought I was him? I stared out of my window, watching the city skyline with an uneasy stillness. Normally, when I was dealing with stress, I'd focus on the numbers, immerse myself in work. But this wasn't about business, and that made it worse. Mallory and we'd had a solid marriage. Sure, the last few months had been hectic, mostly because I'd thrown myself into securing the company's future. Mallory had been patient, supportive even, understanding why I'd been pulling long hours. But then again, I hadn't really told her the full picture. The truth was I hadn't told anyone, not even her, about the $20 million valuation we were heading toward. Call it caution or call it strategy, I wanted to finalize everything before celebrating. Mallory knew the business was doing well, but she had no idea of the sheer scale of success we were about to hit. I sat back down at my desk, staring blankly at the spreadsheet on my screen. But my focus was elsewhere. What if Mallory had been hiding something too? The thought crept in, uninvited but relentless. My mind flipped through the past few months, looking for cracks, for moments when things felt off. I picked up my phone, staring at it like the answer would somehow reveal itself on the screen. The number that had called me, it wasn't saved in my contacts, and a quick search didn't pull up anything useful. Should I call Mallory? Ask her outright what the hell was going on? But I knew her too well. She'd laugh it off, call the guy a crank, or brush it aside with her usual charm. No. If there was something going on, I had to figure it out without tipping my hand. I wasn't about to jump to conclusions based on one weird phone call, but I also wasn't going to ignore it. My phone buzzed again. I almost expected it to be another call from that number, but this time it was a text. From Mallory. Dinner tonight? Miss you. Hope you're not buried in work again. There it was. Normal. Casual. Just like always. She was always good at that, making me feel like she had everything under control. But now I wasn't so sure. I texted her back something vague, telling her I'd try to make it on time. But I already knew I'd be home early. I needed to see her. I needed to look at her and know if something was off, something hidden beneath that perfect smile. Because that phone call, it had planted a seed of doubt. And whether I liked it or not, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cracks were just starting to show. With a deep breath, I closed my laptop, grabbed my jacket, and made a decision. There was something going on, whether it was this David guy or something bigger. I needed to find out. But I wasn't going to confront her just yet. This required a different kind of strategy, the kind I used in business when things didn't add up. I wasn't about to accuse my wife of anything without proof. But that phone call, it had changed something. It was the first ripple in what I feared could become a tidal wave. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the front lawn. The house stood quiet, serene, just like it always did. But tonight, there was something different in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that beneath the surface, something was brewing. I walked in, the familiar scent of dinner wafting from the kitchen. Mallory was cooking, as usual, and Sophie sat at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone, completely absorbed in whatever teenage world she lived in. For a moment, I stood there, watching the scene. It was almost too perfect, too normal. "Dad, you're home," Sophie chirped, looking up briefly before returning to her screen. "You're actually on time for once." I smiled, walking over to kiss her on the forehead. Miracles happen, don't they? Mallory turned from the stove, her face lighting up in that effortless way she always managed. "I was starting to think you'd live at the office forever." She laughed, but there was something in her eyes, something too bright, too forced. I leaned against the counter, watching her stir the pot on the stove. "Busy day?" I asked casually, keeping my tone light. I didn't want to dive in too quickly, not yet. She shrugged, her back still to me. Same old, same old. A few errands, a meeting for the charity thing I'm working on, then picked Sophie up from her friend's house. "You know how it is." I nodded, though my attention drifted to her phone, sitting face down on the counter. It buzzed softly once, then again. Mallory didn't react, too engrossed in her cooking, or maybe pretending not to notice. "Dinner smells great," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. My eyes lingered on the phone for a second longer. I had to play this carefully. Sophie set her phone down, jumping off the stool. "I'm starving. Is it ready yet?" "Almost, honey," Mallory replied, her voice sing-song, the way it always was when she was trying to soothe everyone around her. Sophie's phone buzzed now, pulling her attention again. I watched her absent-mindedly swipe it open, reading whatever message flashed across the screen. It was small things like this, how utterly engrossed everyone always seemed in their phones, that gnawed at me. But today, it was Mallory's phone that held my attention, not Sophie's. Dinner was a quiet affair, mostly light conversation, with Sophie filling the space with chatter about school, her friends, and some upcoming parties she wanted to go to. Mallory smiled, nodding in all the right places, but I noticed how her mind seemed elsewhere. Occasionally, she'd glance toward the window, or her fingers would hover just slightly over the edge of the table as if she was waiting for something. My eyes flicked back and forth between them, my wife and my daughter, trying to spot any shift, any crack. Mallory laughed at something Sophie said, but it was off, just the faintest hint of nervousness, like she was forcing herself to stay present. I wanted to believe it was nothing, that the call earlier in the day was some kind of mistake. But as the evening wore on, the unease gnawed at me. Halfway through dinner, Mallory's phone buzzed again, the vibration just loud enough to interrupt the rhythm of the conversation. This time, she didn't ignore it. "Excuse me for a minute," she said, standing up and grabbing her phone off the counter. "I have to take this. It's important." I nodded, not saying a word, and watched as she left the kitchen, walking briskly toward the hallway, her voice low as she answered. She disappeared into the living room, her footsteps softening as she moved out of earshot. I waited for a beat, then casually stood up, pretending to stretch. Sophie was still engrossed in her phone, oblivious to everything except the glow of the screen in front of her. I made my way toward the hallway, moving quietly, but not so quiet that Sophie would notice anything out of place. Mallory's voice floated from the living room. I caught fragments, pieces of a conversation that made little sense to me. "Yes, Thursday. I told you. No, I'll be there, just like we planned." Her voice dropped lower, too faint to catch the rest. My heart was pounding now. I leaned against the wall, glancing toward where she'd left her phone on the counter. It was risky, but I had to know. I moved back into the kitchen and reached for her phone. Just a quick glance, a few seconds. It was enough. The screen lit up in my hand, and there it was, a message from Derek. "Thursday. Big payday soon, right?" My mind raced. Derek, her work friend. They'd met at some event a while back, some charity gala, I think. Mallory had mentioned him in passing a few times, mostly in the context of work. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, that message, big payday? What payday? I locked the phone and placed it back exactly where she'd left it, careful to make it look untouched. I walked back to the table, trying to keep my face neutral. Sophie hadn't even noticed I was gone. But my thoughts were already swirling in 1,000 directions. Mallory returned a few minutes later, smiling, her usual warm and composed self. "Sorry about that. Just some things I had to sort out." "No problem," I said, playing along. I'd always been good at that, staying calm when the pieces weren't adding up. But inside, my mind was churning. Thursday. Big payday. I pushed my plate aside, no longer hungry, though I forced myself to stay in the moment. Mallory sat back down, chatting away with Sophie like nothing had happened. But I saw it now. The flickers of something else, something deeper going on beneath the surface. After dinner, Mallory cleared the dishes, and I stood at the sink, pretending to wash a glass while my thoughts ran wild. There was a pattern here. I'd been too focused on work, on the $20 million deal, to notice. But now, the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The Thursday meetings, the increased texting, the way she'd been more distant lately, yet oddly enthusiastic about planning things around the house. I needed to know more. That message from Derek hinted at something bigger, something she was keeping from me. And if I confronted her now, I'd only get a story. A carefully crafted one. No, I needed to see it for myself. Later that night, when the house was quiet and Mallory was in the shower, I made my move. I opened the phone tracker we'd set up a long time ago, back when Sophie was still small, more for safety than anything else. I hadn't thought to use it in years, but tonight it was my ace. I quickly set it to track Mallory's movements. If she was going somewhere on Thursday with Derek, I know, and I'd be ready. As I climbed into bed that night, Mallory kissed me goodnight like she always did, her smile soft and unassuming. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the cracks in the perfect image of our life together began to widen. Thursday arrived quicker than I expected. I went through the motions that morning as if nothing had changed, just like any other day. Shower, coffee, a quick kiss on Mallory's cheek before I headed out the door. She smiled, her expression soft and calm. "Don't work too hard today," she said, almost teasing. I gave her a nod, playing my role, pretending everything was still intact. But the truth was, I wasn't heading to the office. Today was different. I waited down the street, tucked behind a line of parked cars where I knew Mallory wouldn't see me. My phone buzzed quietly in the passenger seat. The tracking app I'd set up the night before lit up with a small dot, slowly moving away from our house. I watched it travel across town, far from her usual routine. My pulse quickened. 10 minutes later, her car appeared, driving past me. She didn't see me. Good. I started my car and followed at a distance, careful not to get too close. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots, trying to anticipate what I'd find. Derek's message, Thursday. Big payday soon, right? Echoed in my head. This wasn't just an affair. Something bigger was happening. Mallory drove with purpose, no hesitation in her turns. She wasn't heading to her usual errands, not to the gym, not to lunch with a friend. She was going somewhere I hadn't tracked before, a luxury hotel on the other side of town. The kind of place you go when you don't want to be seen. I parked a block away, watching from a safe distance as she pulled into the hotel lot. She didn't even bother to check her surroundings, like she'd done this 100 times before. She parked, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the entrance. I waited. A few minutes later, he appeared. Derek. He walked toward her like a man who knew exactly what he was about to get. Their greeting wasn't shy, wasn't awkward, wasn't the careful caution of colleagues or acquaintances. No. Derek leaned in, his hand brushing the small of her back, and they kissed, quickly, casually, before disappearing into the hotel lobby. I could feel the breath catch in my throat, not from surprise, but from confirmation. This was it. There was no doubt left. I leaned back in my seat, gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make my knuckles white. My eyes followed the entrance, but they were gone now inside. I didn't need to see more. I didn't need to storm in there and make a scene. That wasn't my style. If this affair had been going on for this long, so casual, so brazen, then Mallory had already made her choice. She wasn't the woman I'd thought she was, and this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment fling. It was more calculated than that. I sat there for a while, letting the weight of it sink in. Not the emotional part, I could deal with that later. No, what gnawed at me was the money. The $20 million. Mallory had no idea about the full valuation. Not yet. But Derek's message, the mention of a big payday, wasn't an accident. She knew enough. She must have sensed the change in the business, the way things were accelerating, the deals I'd been finalizing over the past few months. My chest tightened. I wasn't just dealing with a broken marriage. I was dealing with someone who had likely been plotting her exit for months, maybe longer. Someone who knew she could walk away with half if she timed it right. If Mallory had any inkling about the real numbers, then she wasn't just having an affair for thrills. She was positioning herself to take me for everything. The app pinged again on my phone, Mallory's location unmoving inside the hotel. I watched the screen. Calm now. I didn't need to go inside. I didn't need to catch her in the act. I had everything I needed. An hour later, I was back home, earlier than usual. Mallory wouldn't be home for a while, and Sophie was still at school. I had time. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my laptop screen, my mind spinning. The divorce. That's where this was headed. And if Mallory thought she could blindside me, she was in for a rude awakening. I picked up my phone and dialed. It rang twice before my brother answered. Hey, Ethan. Mark's voice came through, casual, unaware of the storm brewing on my end. What's up? I didn't waste time. I need your advice on something. It's important. Mark had always been the more level-headed one between us. He worked in finance, had a good understanding of contracts, legal structures, and all the little tricks that could make or break a deal. If there was anyone who could help me figure this out, it was him. Yeah? What's going on? He asked, his voice shifting into that tone he used when he knew something serious was up. I told him everything. The phone call, Derek's message, following Mallory to the hotel. I laid it all out, every detail. Mark listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jesus, Ethan, he finally said, his voice low. You're sure about all this? Positive, I replied. I saw it with my own eyes. There was another pause before he spoke again, this time more cautiously. Okay, so, you know she's having an affair. But if she's talking about a payday, then she knows something about your business. Have you told her anything about the valuation? No, she doesn't know the full extent of it. But she knows enough to think there's a lot of money on the line. Then you need to be careful, Mark said, his voice firm. If she's plotting something, especially if she's thinking about leaving, you have to protect yourself. Your assets. All of it. That's why I'm calling you, I said, leaning back in my chair, feeling the weight of it all settle over me. I need to know what my options are. Mark didn't hesitate. First things first, lock down anything that's yours, business accounts, personal savings, everything. If she's planning on divorce, she's going to aim for half. But you need to get ahead of this. And don't confront her yet. Not until you've figured out how to protect yourself legally. Right. I nodded, my mind already racing with plans. I'm not going to say anything until I have everything in place. And Ethan, Mark's voice dropped slightly more serious now. If she knows about the $20 million, you need to assume she's going to go after it. Don't let her blindside you. Be methodical. I hung up a few minutes later, my mind clearer than it had been all week. This wasn't just about the betrayal. Mallory was playing a different game now, one I hadn't anticipated. But if she thought she could outmaneuver me, she was wrong. That night, when Mallory finally came home, she was all smiles again. She kissed me on the cheek like she always did, asked about my day, and joked with Sophie as she helped her with some school project at the dining table. It was the same routine, the same practice perfection. But now, I saw it for what it was, a mask. As I watched her laugh and move around the house like everything was fine, I made my decision. I wasn't going to confront her, not yet. I wasn't going to let her know I'd been watching. No, I'd let her think she was in control for now. I'd let her keep up the charade a little longer. The days passed quietly, but there was an underlying tension in everything. Mallory continued to play her role, perfectly rehearsed, smiling, laughing, keeping things light and warm. But now that I knew what to look for, every action seemed calculated, every glance slightly off. She wasn't slipping up, not yet. But I could see it. The cracks were there. The tracker kept pinging, showing her routine movements, gym, coffee shops, charity meetings. But there were other locations, too, ones I hadn't paid attention to before. A restaurant downtown, the gym she never mentioned to me, and another day, a trip to the same hotel where I'd seen her with Derek. Thursday. That day seemed to be carved out for something I wasn't meant to see. It wasn't long before Sophie brought up something that caught me off guard. We were in the kitchen, her sitting at the counter, eating an after-school snack while I pretended to sort through some work emails. She put her phone down and looked up at me. "Hey, Dad? Has Mom been, weird lately?" she asked, her tone casual, but with a hint of curiosity. I glanced up. "Weird how?" Sophie shrugged, spinning her phone on the counter absent-mindedly. "I don't know. I overheard her talking on the phone the other day. She mentioned something about money and a big break." She frowned slightly. It was strange. She stopped talking when I walked into the room. I froze, but only for a split second before masking my reaction. A big break. That phrase again, just like Derek's message. This wasn't a coincidence. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice neutral. "When was this?" "Yesterday," Sophie said, now completely focused on me. "It's probably nothing, right? She's always busy with work stuff." She seemed to brush it off, but the seed of doubt had been planted. I forced a smile, nodding slowly. "Yeah, it's probably nothing. Your mom's been juggling a lot lately." Sophie returned to her phone, but I could feel the shift in the air. Mallory wasn't just hiding things from me. She was slipping up around Sophie, too. That wasn't part of her plan. And if Sophie was starting to notice, then it was only a matter of time before Mallory made a bigger mistake. The next morning, after Mallory had left for one of her meetings, I made a decision. If I was going to get to the bottom of this, I needed more information. And I had a feeling I knew someone who could provide it. Avery, Mallory's best friend. They'd been close for years, always having lunch together, meeting up for gym sessions, catching up over wine. I'd never thought twice about Avery before. She was part of Mallory's world, not mine. But now I wondered how much she knew. If Mallory had been carrying on this affair with Derek for a year, Avery had to know something. And if I could get her to slip, even just a little, it could blow this thing wide open. I called Avery that afternoon, keeping my tone casual, as if I just wanted to grab coffee and catch up. She sounded surprised, but agreed to meet me at the cafe near the gym she and Mallory frequented. When I arrived, Avery was already there, sitting at a corner table with a latte in front of her. She smiled when she saw me, but there was something in her expression, like she wasn't sure what to expect. "Hey, Ethan," she said as I sat down. "This is a surprise. What's going on?" I forced a casual smile, leaning back in my chair. "Not much. Just wanted to talk. I've been noticing a few things with Mallory lately, and I thought maybe you could help me figure it out." Avery blinked, her smile faltering slightly. "Oh, what kind of things?" I kept my gaze steady. "She's been acting distant. Different. I know you two are close, so I thought maybe you've noticed something too." Avery's fingers tapped lightly against the side of her cup. She avoided my eyes for a moment, then shrugged. "I don't know, Ethan. She's been busy a lot lately, but you know how she is. She's always juggling a million things at once." I nodded slowly. "Yeah, That's what I thought at first, too. But then I started noticing other things, like her meetings with Derek. Avery's face froze for a split second, just enough for me to catch it. But she recovered quickly, plastering on a confused expression. Derek? Her work friend. Yeah, I said, watching her closely. Her work friend. They seem to be meeting up a lot, don't they? Avery shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around the cup. I mean, they've been working on some charity stuff together. That's all I know. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice. Avery, I know there's more going on than just charity work. There it was again, another flicker of panic in her eyes. She looked down, stirring her coffee, but I didn't let the silence hang for too long. If you know something, I continued, you should tell me. Because if Mallory's planning something bigger than just an affair, I need to know. This isn't just about the two of them. It's about money. A lot of money. Avery's face paled. She opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again, clearly torn. I waited, not pushing too hard, but not letting up either. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. Ethan, I don't know everything, okay? But yeah, Mallory's been seeing Derek for a while now. Over a year, I think. She didn't tell me at first, but eventually it slipped out. My heart tightened, but I stayed focused. And Avery hesitated, glancing around the cafe like she was worried someone might overhear. She's been talking about leaving, but not right away. She's waiting for something, some deal you're working on. She thinks once the company hits a certain number, she can leave and take a big chunk with her. I felt the blood drain from my face, but I didn't let it show. So I had been right. This wasn't just an affair. Mallory was planning her exit, and she was going to time it perfectly with the company's valuation. She knew more than I'd realized. How long has she been talking about this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Avery swallowed hard. A few months. I don't think she knows the full details about the money, but she knows enough. She's been planning. It's not just Derek. She's been positioning herself for when everything falls into place. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. Mallory wasn't just cheating. She was strategizing, waiting for the right moment to make her move and take as much as she could with her. And Derek? He was just part of the plan. Maybe he thought they'd ride off into the sunset together, but to Mallory, he was probably nothing more than a tool to keep her distracted until the real payday arrived. I thanked Avery, keeping things cordial, though inside I felt like everything was unraveling faster than I could manage. I left the cafe with one thought hammering in my mind. This wasn't just about love. This was about money. And Mallory was going to make sure she walked away with half of everything I'd built if I didn't act fast. Back at home that evening, Mallory was her usual cheerful self, but I couldn't see her the same way anymore. Every word she said, every smile she gave me, it was all part of a larger game, one she thought she was winning. The plan was simple, yet it held the weight of everything I'd uncovered in the last few weeks. It was time to turn the tables. If Mallory and Derek thought they were smart, thought they could play me for a fool, then I'd let them. Just for one last night. I made the calls early in the week, casual and friendly. I invited a few close friends, and of course, Derek and his wife, Tracy. It wasn't unusual for me to host these small get-togethers. Mallory had always enjoyed playing the gracious hostess, and I knew she wouldn't suspect a thing. Not yet. When I mentioned the dinner to her, she smiled that perfect smile, the one that didn't quite reach her eyes anymore, but it was still enough to disarm most people. Sounds lovely, Ethan, she said, leaning in to kiss me lightly on the cheek. I'll handle the details. Perfect. Let her think she was in control, that everything was going according to her grand design. By the time Thursday evening arrived, the house was prepped, the table set with an almost excessive elegance. Candles flickered in the center, wine glasses polished and waiting. Mallory had outdone herself. Every detail meticulously arranged, a reflection of the image she always projected. Flawless, composed, the perfect wife. But tonight, it was just a facade, a shell of the person she'd once been. Guests arrived, laughter and light conversation filling the air. Mallory flitted between rooms, offering drinks and appetizers like nothing was wrong. Derek arrived fashionably late, with Tracy on his arm. Tracy, unaware, smiling, completely in the dark about her husband's ongoing betrayal. It almost made me feel sorry for her. Almost. I watched them as they stepped into the house. Derek's eyes scanned the room quickly, locking onto Mallory's. It was brief, just a flicker of recognition before he turned to greet me, all false charm and easy grins. Tracy followed suit, kissing Mallory on the cheek like old friends, blissfully unaware of what was lurking beneath the surface. Dinner started smoothly. The wine flowed freely. The conversation kept light, with just enough humor to fill the spaces. Mallory, seated directly across from me, maintained her effortless composure, while Derek chimed in, laughing and engaging in small talk. But I wasn't focused on their words. I was watching their body language, the stolen glances, the subtle tension that hummed between them. It was a dance they'd been performing for months, one they thought no one else could see. Halfway through the meal, I decided it was time to lay the first card on the table. So, I began casually, pouring myself another glass of wine. The company's been doing really well lately. We just hit a huge milestone. Everyone looked up, interest peaked. Mallory froze, her wine glass halfway to her lips. "What kind of milestone?" Derek asked, leaning in slightly. His curiosity was real, but his tone remained light. I smiled, taking a slow sip before answering. "We're looking at a valuation close to $20 million. I watched Mallory's face carefully. She didn't move at first, but there it was, the slightest flicker in her eyes, a brief widening before she regained her composure. She wasn't expecting me to drop that piece of information tonight. She tried to smile, to stay casual, but I saw it, the spark of anticipation. This was what she'd been waiting for. "Oh, wow," Tracy exclaimed, completely unaware of the undercurrents swirling around the table. "That's incredible, Ethan. You must be thrilled." "I am," I replied smoothly. "It's been a long road, but we're finally there. The future looks bright." Mallory's eyes flicked toward Derek for a brief moment, so quick anyone else would have missed it. But I didn't. She was planning something, calculating her next move. Derek shifted in his seat, his expression tight, as if he knew something more was coming. I let the conversation flow again, watching as Mallory tried to steer things back to safer topics. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. As dessert was served, I leaned back in my chair, glancing around the table. "You know," I said, my voice casual, "it's interesting how much changes when there's money on the line. People start showing their true colors." Derek stiffened, his fork hovering over his plate. I could see the muscles in his jaw tighten as he fought to maintain his relaxed demeanor. Mallory was still smiling, but there was a tension in her shoulders now, a barely perceptible shift. She knew I was talking to her, and Derek knew it too. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of pleasantries and goodbyes, with Tracy none the wiser, and Mallory playing her part until the very last guest left. Derek and Tracy were the last to go, with Tracy hugging Mallory tightly, thanking her for the lovely evening. Derek shook my hand, his grip a little too firm, his smile a little too forced. When the door finally closed behind them, the silence that followed was suffocating. I didn't say anything. I just watched as Mallory began clearing the table, her movements methodical, too calm. She didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the weight of the conversation we'd just had. But I could feel it, the storm brewing just beneath the surface. It wasn't until she placed the last plate in the sink that she turned to face me, her arms crossed over her chest. "What the hell was that about?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. I shrugged, playing dumb. "What do you mean?" Mallory's eyes narrowed. "Don't play games with me, Ethan. You've been acting strange all night." I met her gaze, my expression neutral. "Have I? Maybe I'm just tired." "Tired?" she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "You've been different lately. What's going on?" I leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. "I could ask you the same thing, Mallory. What's really going on?" She opened her mouth to respond, but stopped herself, as if weighing her options. She glanced toward the hallway, where Sophie's room was. She wouldn't want to wake her. After a long pause, she shook her head and turned away, muttering something under her breath as she headed upstairs. I didn't follow, let her stew on it for a while. Later that night, I heard the familiar sound of her car, keys jingling softly as she tried to slip out of the house. It was just past midnight, and I knew exactly where she was going. I waited until the front door clicked shut before grabbing my jacket and following her out. She didn't even bother to hide her destination. I trailed her from a distance, keeping my headlights off as I followed her down the highway, straight to the hotel where I'd seen her and Derek before. The same routine, the same betrayal. I parked across the street, watching as she stepped out of her car. She looked around, checking the lot, but I stayed in the shadows. A moment later, Derek pulled in, parking a few spots away. He walked toward her, and they shared a brief glance before heading toward the hotel entrance. But tonight, I wasn't going to let it play out like the last time. I stepped out of my car, crossing the lot quietly, waiting until they were just about to enter the building. Mallory. They both froze. Mallory turned, her face pale in the dim light of the parking lot. Derek stood rigid beside her, his eyes darting between us, panic flickering across his features. "Ethan," Mallory began, but I cut her off with a wave of my hand. "Don't bother," I said, my voice calm, controlled. "I know everything." Derek tried to step forward, his hands up in a defensive gesture. "Listen, Mom?" I didn't even look at him. "I'm not here to listen to excuses, Derek. This is done. Both of you." Mallory's eyes widened, but before she could respond, Tracy stepped out of the shadows, her voice cold and hard. "No, Derek. It's over." The color drained from Derek's face as he spun around to face his wife. Tracy, who had been fed the truth from a third party, someone else who knew what was going on, stood there, her eyes full of fury. She'd known long enough to gather her own evidence, and now she was here, ready to burn it all down. Mallory's breath hitched, her hands trembling at her sides. She looked from me to Derek, and then to Tracy, realizing too late that her world was collapsing faster than she could piece it together. And for the first time, she was no longer in control. When I got home that night, the house was silent, except for the soft ticking of the clock in the hallway. It was late, but I knew Mallory wouldn't be asleep. She was waiting. She had to be. I closed the door quietly behind me, hanging my jacket on the hook like I always did. The house felt different now. Emptier, heavier, like it had absorbed all the tension and secrets that had been festering for months. But tonight, the weight wasn't on me. I knew what was coming, and this time I was in control. As I walked through the living room, I heard the soft rustle of movement from the kitchen. Mallory was sitting at the table, a glass of wine in front of her, half empty. She was staring at the floor, her fingers gripping the glass like it was a lifeline. When she heard me, she looked up, and for a moment, she just stared like she didn't know what to say. I didn't speak. I waited. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice small, almost trembling. "Ethan, we need to talk." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "About what?" She took a deep breath, then stood up, pushing the chair back. "About what's been happening. About everything. I know I made a mistake. A huge mistake. I didn't move. I kept my gaze fixed on her, calm, unmoving. Go on." Mallory's eyes flickered with desperation. "It was Derek, okay? It was stupid, and I don't even know how it started, but it's over now. I ended it. I never meant for it to go this far." She took a step closer, her voice cracking. "I still love you, Ethan. We can fix this. For Sophie. For us." There it was. The plea for sympathy, the appeal to family, to emotions. I'd expected it. But now that it was happening, the cold clarity, I felt surprised even me. I stared at her for a moment, letting her words hang in the air. I could see the panic in her eyes, the fear that she was losing her grip on the situation. "I don't think you understand what's happening here, Mallory," I said quietly. "This isn't just about the affair." Her face paled. "What do you mean?" I stepped closer, dropping my voice to a near whisper, sharp and deliberate. "I know everything. About you and Derek. About your plan. You've been positioning yourself for months, waiting for the company to hit that $20 million valuation, thinking you could walk away with half of it." Her lips parted in shock, her eyes widening. She tried to speak, but no words came out. I continued, relentless now. "You thought you'd leave with Derek once the money was locked in. You thought you'd take half of everything I've built, everything we built together. But you were wrong, Mallory. You were so wrong." She blinked, shaking her head, trying to regain control. I wasn't planning to leave like that. I wanted to secure something for myself, for the future. I wasn't sure where we were headed, and you thought you could manipulate me into staying long enough to cash out. I cut in, my voice hard. Don't pretend this was about securing the future for our family. This was about you and what you thought you could take. Her face crumpled, her hands shaking as she reached for the back of the chair to steady herself. Ethan, please. I didn't mean for it to go this way. I didn't know what to do. I took a deep breath, my patience wearing thin. I've already spoken to my lawyers. Mallory's eyes widened in horror, her mouth opening in protest. But I didn't give her time to react. You won't see a cent of that $20 million, I said coldly. There's a prenuptial agreement in place that you clearly forgot about. You have no claim to the business or anything tied to it. All of the assets, my savings, the accounts, everything is protected. The color drained from her face, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. Not fear of losing me, but fear of losing the money, the security she thought she was guaranteed. She shook her head, her voice breaking. You can't do this to me. After everything, I gave you years of my life. I can't just walk away with nothing. Years? I scoffed, stepping closer. You spent the last year lying to me, plotting behind my back. You had your chance, Mallory, and you threw it away. She stared at me, her hands trembling as she reached out, trying to grab onto whatever shred of hope she had left. Please, Ethan, think about Sophie. We can fix this. We can still make it work. I love you, I held up my hand, cutting her off again. Sophie already knows. The words hit her like a sledgehammer. Mallory's face went from desperation to disbelief in an instant. What? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I told her the truth. I said, my voice steady. She knows about you and Derek. She knows what you've been doing. Mallory's knees seemed to buckle as she collapsed into the chair, her hand covering her mouth. No, she can't. She can't. And she does. I leaned in, my voice low and cold. You thought you could keep her in the dark, just like you did with me. But now she knows everything. And she doesn't want to speak to you. Tears welled up in Mallory's eyes, but I felt nothing. This wasn't about love or regret anymore. This was about consequences. Consequences she never thought she'd have to face. What am I supposed to do? She whispered, her voice breaking. I can't lose Sophie. I can't. I watched her for a moment, the reality of what she'd done finally crashing down around her. That's not my problem anymore, I said quietly. You made your choices, Mallory. Now you have to live with them. She sat there, staring at me in stunned silence, her tears falling unchecked now. But I wasn't moved. The woman sitting in front of me wasn't the person I had built a life with. She was a stranger who had betrayed everything we once had. After what felt like an eternity, Mallory stood up, unsteady on her feet. She wiped her eyes, her expression hollow. I'll go, she whispered, almost to herself. I'll pack some things. I nodded, stepping aside as she walked past me, her steps slow and defeated. She disappeared down the hallway, and I heard the faint sound of her closet door opening, the soft rustle of clothes being pulled from hangers. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. An hour later, she reappeared, a small suitcase in hand. She looked at me one last time, her eyes red and swollen, her face etched with a sadness she had no right to claim. I'm sorry, she whispered, for everything. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Mallory walked out the front door, and with a soft click, she was gone. The house was quiet again, but this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't oppressive, wasn't suffocating like before. It was peaceful, final. Sophie came down the stairs a few minutes later, her face pale but determined. She glanced at the door, then back at me. Is she gone? I nodded. She's gone. Sophie exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing. Good? I watched her for a moment, seeing the strength in her that I hadn't noticed before. She was going to be okay. We were going to be okay. As I stood there, I realized that the closure I had been chasing wasn't about revenge or money or even getting the last word. It was about freeing myself from the weight of betrayal. And in that moment, I finally felt it. The game was over, and I had won. Thank you for listening to this story. Subscribe to the channel, put a like under the video, and write a comment about how you like this story.